Hello students, I am Dr. Ritvik Ganthe and today we are going to understand the meaning and characteristics of social problems. This is first module of the paper Social Problems and Management of Welfare Services. So today we start off with understanding social problems and the key characteristics that these problems have. Now, even before we try to understand the meaning of social problems, let us try to find out in which way the social problem as a sociological term has been defined by the scholars. So the main important points that you should consider while defining social problem is that it's a kind of a behavior which is unwelcoming. At the same time, it is a condition which is not viewed favorably or in a good light. So a basic statement becomes like any condition or behavior that has negative consequences for a large number of people and is generally recognized as a condition. So a large number of people should be of the view that a particular social condition is problematic and have negative consequences for the large number of people. If this condition meets, then that kind of a social situation can be termed as social problem. At the same time, this is very important to note that any social problem has two components, that is objective component and subjective component. What are these two components? We will have a look in the coming slides, but there are two takeaways initially. Number one, that is any social situation which people, a large number of people in society believed to have negative consequences for a good number of people. And secondly, that social situation should have two components, that is objective component and the subjective components. In fact, that's a nature, that's a rule of nature, that every situation will have these two components. So that we will understand in the coming slides. Let us have a look at a technical definition of social problems, which is given by Oxford Dictionary of Sociology way back in 1994. What it says, and I quote, "Social problem is a generic term applied to a range of conditions and aberrant behaviors which are manifestations of social disorganization." Here the key term is social disorganization. It is a condition. Again, it defines it as a condition. It is a condition which most people in a society consider undesirable. This is a key term. And want to correct by changing through some means of social engineering or social planning. So, the important takeaway is that this situation can be changed by some means of social engineering or social planning. At the same time, it's a condition which is considered undesirable by most of the people. So there is a consensus, and whenever there is a consensus, then only that particular situation can be termed as social problem. So this is a classic definition which can be quoted for defining social problems. Now let us try to understand some of the important meanings that this particular term carries. Again, the central theme of defining social problems comes to play here. That is, a condition can be termed as social problem, or a social situation can be termed as social problem if and only if it has the potential to disrupt or damage society. That is, a crime or some kind of a social situation like racism and all. In Western context and Indian context, it could be casteism, some kind of oppression of backward sections, etc. So, whenever there is a social situation which has a potential to damage the other sections of a society, that particular situation can be termed as social problem. At the same time, here there is something very important should be noted, that is known as constructionist view of the social problems. Students, Most of the times, sociologists have a different thought process. Sociologists argue that social situation can be termed as social problem, but social problems are not exactly the problems. The problems are created ones, or the problems are with the view of the people. So, a particular situation can become or can be assumed to be social problem when there is a view associated with that problem that this is a problematic condition, and more often than not, such view is created with the help of other media, activism, and advocacy processes. This approach is known as social constructionist approach to define the social problem. In this approach, most of the times a particular situation is chosen, and then people try to create a kind of activism around that particular condition in order to convince the large section of society that this particular condition has potential to damage, or it can cause damage in long run to society in some or the other way. If that objective is met, social constructionist view says then in that condition only a social situation can be termed as social problem. So students, by and large, now you know the definition of social problem, that the meaning that this particular term carries, and also some of the important components like objective component, subjective component, and social constructionist view that is associated with social problems. Let us now have a look at the process which social constructionist view claims to adopt while creating a situation into social problem. Now what they say? They say that, for example, you take any problem or any social situation rather. In order to make it a social problem, social constructionist view says that first of all, you need to claim that this particular situation is a social problem. So how do you claim? The claims are made mostly through social media, mainstream media. At the same time, some newspaper articles, some kind of advocacy, some policy groups are behind that, and environment is created in which it is attempted to show that how this particular situation is very much problematic and it has potential to damage the other sections, and that's how whole you can say to some extent that a bubble is created. Although the bubble is more real, but still a bubble is created. Some advocacy needs to be done here that will actually propagate that particular situation as a social problem. Then once the claims are made, it is obvious that some people would agree with that claim, some people would not agree with that claim, some people will see the logic in that claim of that situation being a social problem. So some people would obviously argue in support of this particular group which is trying to portray a particular situation as a problem, and at the same time some of the people would naturally take their position against the position of this particular group of people who is trying to portray the situation as a problem. So there are some claims and counterclaims, that kind of process goes on. And then ultimately some external help is sought to generate the public opinion. Now this public opinion building is a very important component and important exercise in this entire process. Through various means, as I already explained, through media especially, the public opinion is attempted to build. And then only if the public opinion is of the opinion or is with the opinion which says that this particular situation is a social problem, then only that particular situation is treated by and large a social problem. For example, dowry. Now once upon a time, dowry was not considered as a social problem. But in the meantime, there were some gruesome episodes pertaining to the consequences of this particular practice, and then some of these scholars and thinkers really argued that this is a bad practice and it should be eradicated from the society. And similarly, there are a number of other social customs and practices and so on and so forth, which many scholars claim that it should be removed because this is a problem. So how it became a problem? Because the social constructionist view says that you create a public opinion in order to portray a social situation as a social problem. So most of the sociological thinkers do argue in this line. And that's how ultimately policymakers come to know about the situation, and they try to define the situation as a social problems, and then they try to take some corrective measures and which can effectively solve the situation. Students, this entire process which I just mentioned is a complex process, and so it started off in research and theory somewhere around 1970s. So you see that this constructionist approach began to guide the researchers somewhere around 1970s, and then these researchers actually realized, and most of these researchers were the sociologists, they actually realized that we can create a problem. If there is not a problem, or there may be or may not be some problematic element or some potential to damage society, but we can play around with the public opinion. And the moment they got convinced with this idea that the public opinion is something which can be played around with, they started experimenting with this, and finally it evolved as a social constructionist view. So that's what it is mentioned here. And at the same time, as I already told you, this entire process is a complex process because a lot of stakeholders are involved in this. The government is involved, media is involved, scholarship is involved. At the same time, social groups are involved, and the most important thing is the society at large is the biggest stakeholder in this entire process. And so therefore, this particular process of defining, creating, building social problem or a social situation is very important to understand. And that's how we should be as a sociologists. We should think that how social problems are evolved. And the moment we really understand that the evolution path of social problems, maybe then probably the same remedy is there, the same process is there, which really becomes the remedy to all these social problems. So unless and until you really know how the problems are created, you can never know how the problems can be solved. So since we want to become the problem solvers, we really need to understand how these problems are created. Let us briefly understand the objective and subjective components of social problem. In a very simple way, let me put it this way, that objective component is that aspect of social problem which gets the other people convinced about the problem, or which really helps to understand that why this particular situation should be considered as a problem. So it is an objective component, right? It has no influencers involved, but it's very objective, it's very fair, and it logically argues this. These are the problematic areas, these are the problem areas, this is the potential to damage, and this is how a damage can happen. So it involves a lot of argumentation and a lot of logic that actually goes into play, and it really builds the whole logic of how this particular situation is a problem. So that is what we call objective component. So every social situation has objective component, or rather the social problem has objective component, because by that time the situation is already turned into a problem. Then the second thing is subjective component. So objective component and subjective component. Now subjective component is the contrarian view. That means this is just the opposite view. For example, if somebody argues that, okay, this particular social evil is a social problem, and henceforth it should be known as social evil, even going forward, it should be termed as social evil, not just problem, because this has so many damage potential, this can cause, that can cause, it has so many bad practices and all that argumentation part. So that is objective component of the social situation. Now the contrarian view to that, somebody suppose comes up and says and tries to counter argue and claims that, okay, but this is your view and there are contrarian views, there are some other arguments and logics which go against this particular argument, and try to establish the fact that it's not as big a problem as you are trying to portray, or it's not really the problem. In fact, after a certain period of time, this is important, This can have the other consequences which are which are beneficial, and so on. So many favorable arguments can also be there. Some contrarian views can also be there. That is known as subjective component of the social problem. I will give you a small example of climate change. Most of us do really believe that climate change is happening, and climate change is causing a lot of problem and troubles, and it's untimely rain and excessive winters and excessive summers, and all that is basically problem of climate change. But let me tell you the contrarian view. Let me give you the counter argument, which is basically saying that climate change is not a problem at all. And there are scholars which we will understand, which we will know in the next classes, in the next lectures, that how people counter argue, and they established the fact that climate change is just a phenomena in which is being propagated by certain sections of society, certain ideological sections of society, and that's how they say that it's actually not a problem at all. So you see, there are arguments and counter arguments for a particular social situation, and so the arguments which portray that as a problem are the objective components, and the arguments that portray that not as big a problem, or in fact not at all a problem, it's a subjective component of the problem. And we understood this with the help of an example of climate change. Now we should discuss the characteristics of social problems. Now there are some characteristics which are obviously carved from the meaning and definition of the social problems. And since we have already discussed these meanings and problems at length, there is no need to really discuss each one of them in great details, but rather I would like to tell that these characteristics are taken from the book from Ahuja, which was first published in 2002, and it gives you 9 simple characteristics of social problems, which are by and large the same things which we have just discussed. So it talks about a social problem is a situation, then second characteristic says it's a deviation from the ideal situation. Again, common basis of origin has to happen, then only the situation can be termed a social problem. Social problems are social and political in origin, that's another characteristic. And social problems are caused by pathological social conditions, again a behavioral issue. Sixth characteristic says that social problems are interconnected, as I already told you. One problem is connected with the other one. Social problems are social in their results, in fact, meaning which the problems have the potential to damage, but the damage would be social. The damage will not be in other sphere of life, for example, financial matters or economy or political damage and all. The damage could be social in nature. So the social relationships and all things like that. The responsibility of social problems, basically it requires a collective action. So the 8th characteristic says that the response, since the problem is social, the response has to be social, that is the collective response has to take place. And social problems occur in all societies. That's the 9th important prerequisite. So there is no society which can claim that they don't have any social problem. So these are the 9 important characteristics. And students, with that, we conclude this particular module. In this module, we try to understand the definition, meaning, and characteristics of social problems. We also try to understand the objectives and subjective component of the social problems. At the same time, we learned about the social constructionist view, which propagates the idea of creation of social problem from a particular social situation. Thank you.